Adolf Hitler maintained an unusual fixation on Winston Churchill's relationship with alcohol. Throughout the conflict, Nazi propaganda operations continuously manufactured caricatures portraying a bloated, gin-saturated British bulldog lurching through 10 Downing Street. Joseph Goebbels allocated complete radio broadcasts to deriding Churchill as a whiskey-drenched warmonger whose choices emerged from an alcoholic stupor. Hitler himself, a fanatical abstainer who recoiled from alcohol's mere odor, discovered Churchill's reputation as a drinker simultaneously perplexing and beneficial. In confidential discussions documented by his closest circle, the Führer persistently cited Churchill's habitual alcoholism as demonstration of British deterioration and vulnerability. For Hitler, an individual who commenced his mornings with weak whiskey and soda during breakfast appeared fundamentally frivolous, a vestige of an empire drinking its way toward irrelevance. However, this wasn't merely commentary. It represented strategic personality demolition. Hitler needed Churchill to appear as an alcoholic because it rationalized something terrifying. How might this corpulent 65-year-old individual possessing a speech defect continuously outwit the Third Reich's mastermind? The disparagement served numerous objectives within Nazi philosophy. It reinforced their account of Aryan restraint contrasted with Anglo-Saxon degeneracy. It furnished German civilians with a reassuring rationale for why their apparently invincible Wehrmacht persisted in stumbling against British opposition. Most significantly, it sought to delegitimize Churchill's standing both internationally and throughout Britain itself, where numerous conservative colleagues harbored profound misgivings about his wisdom. The propaganda hadn't been entirely fabricated without basis. Churchill's association with alcohol was extensively documented and authentically exceptional by contemporary norms. He concealed nothing regarding his consumption. Visitors to Chartwell, his rural residence, reported whiskey glasses beside his bedside, champagne during midday meals, and brandy continuing through evenings. Political opponents within Westminster had whispered regarding his drinking for decades, particularly throughout his wilderness period of the 1930s, when he stood politically marginalized while warning about Hitler, whilst most Britons pursued appeasement. Lord Halifax, who contended with Churchill for the premiership during May 1940, privately questioned whether an individual with Churchill's established patterns could be entrusted with national survival. These domestic uncertainties provided Nazi propaganda authentic kernels to amplify. What Hitler fundamentally misunderstood represented the difference between drinking and drunkenness. Churchill sustained an almost perpetual, meticulously calibrated alcohol consumption throughout his waking periods, yet witnesses uniformly observed he never appeared intoxicated. His physician, Lord Moran, noted that Churchill's intake was ritualistic, rather than dependency-motivated, a performance of Edwardian gentleman traditions, as much as actual indulgence. American commanders who cooperated with him during wartime, including Dwight Eisenhower, remarked upon his mental precision even during late-night strategic discussions accompanied by brandy. His personal secretaries documented that his dictation remained exact, his recall for particulars extraordinary, and his work capability genuinely superhuman, frequently 18-hour days that would deplete individuals half his years. Hitler's insistence upon the intoxicated Churchill narrative disclosed more concerning the Führer's personal rigidity than his opponent's deficiencies. Hitler's abstinence wasn't purely personal preference. It constituted ideological purity, component of his self-constructed identity as an ascetic prophet conducting Germany toward destiny. He regarded self-denial as strength while viewing indulgence as corruption. This binary reasoning would plague his military choices throughout the entire war. Meanwhile, the individual he dismissed as a drunkard was preparing to demonstrate that flexibility, psychological resilience, and capability to reason lucidly under sustained pressure mattered considerably more than sobriety. The drunk stood ready to deliver the Reich's supposedly clear-headed leadership the struggle of its lifetime. Churchill's decade within the political wilderness, roughly 1929 through 1939, furnished Hitler's propagandists with their richest material. Throughout these years, while Churchill obsessively cautioned about German rearmament, the British establishment marginalized him as an unstable warmonger. His conservative colleagues perceived him as erratic, his judgment questionable, his rhetoric exaggerated. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, alongside his inner circle, actively worked preventing Churchill from government, considering him excessively bellicose for delicate diplomacy required with Hitler. The whispers concerning his drinking intensified during this era, weaponized by political adversaries who discovered it simpler to question his sobriety than confront his uncomfortable predictions regarding Nazi intentions. The timing proved devastating. Throughout 1933, as Hitler consolidated authority, Churchill delivered parliamentary addresses warning that Germany was covertly rebuilding its aviation forces, violating Versailles Treaty restrictions. He cited intelligence from his personal network of contacts, junior officers, diplomats, and European associates who supplied him information the government preferred ignoring. The Foreign Office dismissed these warnings as alarmist fantasies, the ravings of an individual whose judgment had been compromised by personal demons. When Churchill claimed during 1934 that German military aircraft production was approaching British levels, government ministers publicly contradicted him, suggesting his sources proved as unreliable as his habits. Baldwin's government painted him as a dangerous drunk, attempting to drag Britain into unnecessary conflict. The alcohol rumors served appeasement perfectly. If Churchill was intoxicated, his warnings about Kristallnacht in November 1938 could be dismissed. If he was enslaved to the bottle, his fury over the Munich Agreement when Chamberlain handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler was merely brandy-fueled hysteria rather than strategic clarity. Nazi intelligence services monitoring British political discourse through embassy channels noted these internal divisions with satisfaction. Goebbels' propaganda ministry gleefully amplified British newspaper cartoons depicting Churchill as a warmongering drunk, redistributing them across occupied Europe. The narrative was perfectly circular. Churchill wants war because he's irrational, and he's irrational because he drinks. What rendered this character assassination particularly effective was Churchill's refusal to moderate his public image. Lesser politicians might have adopted teetotalism to prove their critics wrong. Churchill did the opposite. He continued hosting champagne luncheons at the Savoy, continued his evening drinks, continued making no apologies for his Edwardian lifestyle. This stubbornness was partly aristocratic privilege. He genuinely didn't believe he needed to justify himself to smaller men, but it was also strategic defiance. Churchill understood that appearing to buckle under criticism would validate it. His lifestyle was authentically him, and any attempt to hide it would suggest guilt. So he carried on, even as it cost him political capital during the very years when his warnings about Hitler proved prophetically accurate. By March 1939, when Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia, Churchill's years of drunken ranting suddenly looked like sober prescience. The German occupation of Prague finally shattered Britain's appeasement consensus. Chamberlain, humiliated, began his belated military preparations. Yet even as war became inevitable, Churchill remained outside the cabinet. The old guard's reluctance wasn't merely about past disagreements. It was about trust. Could a man with his reputation be given wartime responsibility? When Britain finally declared war on September 3, 1939, Churchill was brought back as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he'd held in 1914. The Royal Navy signaled to all ships, "Winston is back." But the whispers about his fitness for higher office persisted, and Hitler's propagandists took careful note. If circumstances forced this drunkard into ultimate power, the Führer's dismissive narrative was already prepared. On May 10, 1940, two catastrophes converged. At dawn, German panzers smashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassing France's Maginot Line in a tactical stroke that would bring Western Europe to its knees within 6 weeks. That same morning, Neville Chamberlain's government collapsed. The Norway campaign disaster, a botched attempt to prevent German occupation of Scandinavia, had destroyed what remained of Parliament's confidence in his leadership. Britain needed a new prime minister, as the Wehrmacht demonstrated precisely the kind of mobile warfare Churchill had warned about for years. The choice came down to two men: Lord Halifax, the respectable foreign secretary who still believed negotiated peace with Hitler was possible, and Winston Churchill, the controversial First Lord whose warnings had been vindicated in the most terrible way imaginable. Halifax represented everything the establishment trusted: calm, diplomatic, aristocratic, and most importantly, moderate in his habits and views. He'd been Chamberlain's closest ally in appeasement and maintained backdoor channels to Berlin through Swedish intermediaries. King George VI personally preferred Halifax, considering Churchill too volatile for the constitutional monarchy. Senior conservatives worried that Churchill's appointment would be interpreted as a deliberate escalation, closing the door on any negotiated settlement. The whispers about alcohol resurfaced with renewed urgency during the crucial cabinet discussions on May 9th. Could Britain truly trust its survival to a 65-year-old man who drank whiskey at breakfast and made impulsive decisions? Halifax's supporters argued that sobriety, both literal and metaphorical, was essential for the dark days ahead. But Halifax made a fatal admission during the crisis meetings: he didn't want the job. As a member of the House of Lords rather than Commons, he'd struggled to command Parliament during wartime. More honestly, he recognized that the kind of war Churchill advocated, total resistance regardless of cost, was beyond his temperament. Halifax was a negotiator who believed reasonable men could always find accommodation. Churchill was a romantic warrior who believed Nazi Germany represented existential evil that couldn't be bargained with. On the evening of May 9th, Halifax effectively removed himself from consideration. The following afternoon, as German tanks reached the Meuse River and Belgian defenses crumbled, Churchill kissed the king's hand and became prime minister. He later wrote that he felt a profound sense of relief, as though his entire life had been preparation for this moment. Hitler's initial reaction, relayed through diplomatic channels, was dismissive satisfaction. Goebbels' diary entry from May 11th noted that Churchill's appointment was England's last desperate throw of the dice, and predicted the whiskey-soaked warmonger would lead Britain to swift defeat through irrational stubbornness. Nazi intelligence had compiled thick dossiers on Churchill's drinking, his financial troubles, his political enemies, his history of strategic failures like Gallipoli in 1915. They genuinely believed this was good news for Germany. A sober, calculating leader like Halifax might have sued for peace whilst Britain still had bargaining chips. Churchill, they assumed, would make emotional, alcohol-impaired decisions that would accelerate British collapse. The Wehrmacht's stunning success in France seemed to confirm this analysis. Surely Churchill's brandy courage couldn't stand against German armored doctrine. What neither Hitler nor his intelligence services grasped was that Britain's circumstance demanded exactly Churchill's qualities. The military situation was objectively catastrophic. France was collapsing. The British Expeditionary Force was retreating towards the Channel coast, and invasion seemed imminent. A reasonable leader would have calculated the odds and sought terms. Churchill's supposed irrationality, his romantic faith in British resilience, his rhetorical defiance that bordered on theatrical melodrama, his absolute refusal to consider defeat, was precisely the psychology required. His first speech as Prime Minister on May 13th promised nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. No false optimism, no sugarcoating, but also no surrender. The drunk understood something the sober strategists missed. Morale and willpower would matter more than force ratios in the struggle ahead. The actual truth of Churchill's drinking habits was far more complex and disciplined than Nazi propaganda suggested. His daily routine, meticulously documented by secretaries and family members, revealed a man who drank constantly but strategically. He began each morning around 8 o'clock with a weak whiskey and soda in bed, whilst reading newspapers and intelligence reports. The whiskey, heavily diluted with Malvern water, more ritual than intoxication. His valet, Norman McGowan, later confirmed the glass contained perhaps an ounce of Johnny Walker Red Label submerged in soda water, a mixture that would barely register in a breathalyzer test. Churchill himself joked that he'd taken more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken out of him, and the chemistry supported his claim. Luncheon brought champagne, typically Paul Roger, his preferred brand. He'd consume perhaps 2 glasses over a meal that stretched from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., accompanied by rich food that further slowed alcohol absorption. His physician noted that Churchill almost never drank on an empty stomach, a crucial factor in maintaining cognitive function. The afternoon involved his famous nap, a 90-minute sleep that effectively reset his metabolism and allowed him to work through the night. Upon waking around 5 p.m., he'd bathe, change, and have a weak scotch whilst reviewing papers. Dinner brought wine, port, and brandy, again spread over hours, never gulped, always accompanied by substantial food. His private secretary, John Colville, calculated that Churchill's total daily alcohol intake, while substantial by volume, was distributed across 16 to 18 waking hours, maintaining a relatively constant low blood alcohol level rather than peaks of intoxication. Medical research from the 1990s examining Churchill's documented consumption patterns alongside his work output suggests he maintained what clinicians call functional tolerance. His body had adapted to process alcohol efficiently without cognitive impairment. Dr. John H. Mather's 2006 analysis in the British Medical Journal noted that Churchill's combination of high fluid intake, regular substantial meals, biphasic sleep pattern, and constant physical activity created a metabolic environment where alcohol's sedating effects were minimized. Crucially, Churchill never exhibited the classic signs of alcohol dependency. No morning tremors, no withdrawal symptoms when circumstances prevented drinking, no progressive tolerance requiring ever larger amounts. During transatlantic crossings, when seasickness made drinking unpleasant, he simply stopped with no apparent difficulty. The contrast with Hitler's pharmaceutical consumption was stark, though less publicized. Whilst the Führer self-righteously abstained from alcohol and tobacco, his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, administered daily injections of a compound called Vitamultin, which contained methamphetamine. Medical records recovered after the war revealed that from 1941 onwards, Hitler received increasing doses of stimulants, opiates, and hormone preparations. A pharmaceutical cocktail that produced mood swings, insomnia, tremors, and increasingly erratic decision-making. By 1944, Hitler was receiving up to 8 injections daily. His famous rages, his refusal to retreat from indefensible positions, his growing detachment from military reality, all bore hallmarks of stimulant psychosis rather than strategic genius. Churchill's speeches provided the most compelling evidence against the drunkenness narrative. Between 1940 and 1945, he delivered hundreds of addresses to Parliament, radio broadcasts to the nation, and diplomatic presentations to Allied leaders. Recordings preserve his voice. The slight lisp was congenital, not alcohol-induced, and his articulation remained precise under pressure. His "We shall fight on the beaches" speech on June 4, 1940, lasted 36 minutes and contained complex nested clauses delivered without notes or stumbling. His ability to extemporize during parliamentary debates, responding to hostile questions with cutting wit and detailed policy knowledge, demonstrated cognitive sharpness incompatible with intoxication. American broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, who spent considerable time with Churchill during the Blitz, noted that he'd never seen the Prime Minister obviously drunk. He drank, certainly, but his mind remained a steel trap. The Dunkirk evacuation between May 26 and June 4, 1940, became the first major test of whether Churchill's decision-making was sound or suicidal. The British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 British and French troops, was trapped against the Channel coast as German panzers closed in. Lord Halifax pressed for immediate peace negotiations, arguing that Britain's bargaining position would never be stronger than before the army was annihilated. Churchill faced the most consequential choice of his premiership: authorize withdrawal and risk losing the entire force in a maritime slaughter, or sue for terms whilst Britain still had an army in being. Goebbels' propaganda ministry gleefully prepared material mocking the drunk's desperate gamble, anticipating a massacre that would vindicate every Nazi claim about Churchill's impaired judgment. What actually unfolded demonstrated ice-cold calculation disguised as romantic defiance. Churchill had received intelligence from Bletchley Park, Britain's code-breaking center, indicating that Hitler had ordered panzers to halt their advance on May 24th, allowing the Luftwaffe to finish off the trapped forces. This inexplicable decision, later called the halt order, gave Churchill a narrow window. He immediately ordered Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay to begin Operation Dynamo, while simultaneously authorizing RAF Fighter Command to throw everything into air cover over the beaches. The decision to commit the RAF was particularly calculated. Britain's fighter strength was limited, and some advisors argued it should be hoarded for homeland defense. Churchill understood that without air cover, evacuation was impossible, and without the army, Britain couldn't continue the war regardless of how many fighters remained. His cabinet meetings during those 9 days revealed a man thinking with absolute clarity under crushing pressure. Minutes from the War Cabinet, declassified decades later, showed Churchill systematically demolishing Halifax peace proposals with cold logic. On May 28th, he told the cabinet that Hitler's terms would reduce Britain to a slave state, that any guarantee from Nazi Germany was worthless given Czechoslovakia and Poland, and that negotiating from weakness invited worse terms than fighting to a stalemate. He then did something extraordinary. He gathered the 25 members of the Outer Cabinet, politicians who'd spent years doubting his judgment, and delivered an impromptu speech that left many in tears. He told them plainly, if this Long Island story were to end, it would end only when we were choking on our own blood. The room erupted in support. Halifax's peace faction was politically isolated. The evacuation itself succeeded beyond rational expectation. A hastily assembled fleet of 850 vessels, destroyers, ferries, fishing boats, private yachts, shuttled back and forth under German bombardment. Churchill's decision to commit the RAF proved decisive. Spitfires and Hurricanes flew 2,739 sorties, shooting down 156 German aircraft and disrupting Luftwaffe bombing runs enough to allow the evacuation to proceed. By June 4th, 338,226 soldiers had been rescued, including 123,000 French troops. Goebbels' prepared mockery of the drunken disaster had to be hastily rewritten into claims of German magnanimity. Nazi propaganda insisted Hitler had deliberately allowed the British to escape to encourage peace negotiations, an obvious fiction that fooled no one. Churchill's speech to Parliament on June 4th framed Dunkirk brilliantly, acknowledging it was a military defeat whilst transforming it into a moral victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he admitted, before pivoting to defiant resolve. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. German intelligence intercepts showed Hitler's growing frustration with Churchill's refusal to behave logically. A rational leader would have recognized Britain's hopeless strategic position after France's collapse and sought terms. Churchill's supposed alcoholic irrationality, his romantic faith that Britain could survive alone, was revealed as something far more dangerous to Nazi ambitions. A leader willing to accept objective military disadvantage in service of long-term psychological warfare. The drunk had just snatched Britain's army from certain destruction through sober risk calculation, then spun a humiliating retreat into a rallying cry that unified the nation behind continued resistance. The Battle of Britain, fought between July and October 1940, became the definitive refutation of Nazi assumptions about Churchill's impaired judgment. Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, confidently predicted his Air Force would pummel Britain into submission within weeks, paving the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion across the Channel. Goering himself was no stranger to substance abuse, having developed a morphine addiction after being wounded in the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, but he projected Teutonic efficiency whilst dismissing his opponent as a brandy-soaked amateur, meddling in military affairs. Hitler anticipated that once German bombers demonstrated their might, Churchill's cabinet would finally overthrow their intoxicated leader and install someone reasonable like Halifax. Instead, they encountered a defensive strategy of such calculated cunning that it systematically dismantled Luftwaffe effectiveness. Churchill's crucial decision was to resist the politically tempting impulse to micromanage fighter command. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a difficult personality whom many senior officers disliked, had developed an integrated air defense system combining radar stations, observer corps, fighter direction centers, and carefully husbanded Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons. Churchill received enormous pressure to disperse fighters across Britain to show the flag and maintain civilian morale. He refused, trusting Dowding's unglamorous mathematics over theatrical gestures. When German raids hit Portsmouth on July 11, 1940, killing civilians whilst fighters remained grounded at distant bases awaiting optimal interception vectors, politicians howled that Churchill's drinking had made him callous. He absorbed the criticism and maintained Dowding's strategy, concentrating force at decisive points rather than spreading it thin for psychological comfort. The intelligence dimension revealed Churchill at his most strategic. Bletchley Park was providing increasingly reliable decrypts of Luftwaffe communications through the breaking of Enigma codes, one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Churchill received daily decrypts showing German target priorities, squadron strengths, and operational planning. On August 15th, intelligence indicated the Luftwaffe would launch its largest coordinated assault, over 2,000 sorties against multiple targets. Churchill authorized Dowding to commit maximum resources, resulting in what became known as the Greatest Day. 108 German aircraft destroyed versus 29 British fighters lost. Nazi propagandists scrambled to explain how a drunk's Air Force had achieved a 4-to-1 kill ratio against Aryan supermen. Goering made a catastrophic blunder that Churchill exploited with sober precision. Through August, the Luftwaffe had been systematically attacking RAF airfields and radar stations, the correct strategy for achieving air superiority. British fighter strength was genuinely diminishing, with pilot exhaustion becoming critical. Then, on the night of August 24th, lost German bombers accidentally dropped ordnance on London's East End. Churchill immediately ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin, militarily insignificant but psychologically calculated. Hitler, enraged that his capital had been violated, overruled Göring's targeting priorities and ordered the Luftwaffe to shift from airfields to London. Starting on September 7th, the Blitz battered British cities, but gave fighter commands battered airfields crucial recovery time. Churchill had goaded Hitler into a strategic error through emotional manipulation. Hardly the behavior of an impaired mind. The numbers told the story of superior decision-making. By October 31st, when Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,733 aircraft versus 915 British fighters destroyed. More crucially, Fighter Command's operational capability had been preserved. Britain maintained air superiority over its own territory, making invasion impossible. Churchill's refusal to interfere with Dowding's tactical decisions, his willingness to absorb political heat for unpopular choices, his exploitation of intelligence advantages, and his psychological manipulation of Hitler's ego demonstrated cognitive functioning at the highest level. Goebbels's propaganda increasingly stopped mentioning Churchill's drinking during this period. The insult had become counterproductive when the drunk was systematically outthinking sober German leadership. By late 1940, Nazi internal communications showed growing respect tinged with frustration. Churchill wasn't behaving like the degenerate alcoholic their ideology insisted he must be. Churchill's greatest strategic coup was seducing neutral America into Britain's corner. Whilst Hitler's rigid ideology made comparable diplomacy impossible, President Franklin Roosevelt, constrained by powerful isolationist sentiment in Congress and the 1940 election cycle, couldn't openly aid Britain without political suicide. Yet Churchill, supposedly a brandy-addled relic, conducted a masterclass in long-distance manipulation that transformed the Anglo-American relationship from formal neutrality to undeclared alliance. He began with a letter on May 15, 1940, 5 days into his premiership, addressing Roosevelt as former naval person, a reference to their shared experience leading their respective navies during the First World War. This intimate tone, cultivated through hundreds of subsequent letters, created personal rapport that transcended diplomatic formality. The correspondence revealed Churchill's strategic patience and psychological sophistication. He never directly begged for help, which would have triggered American suspicion of British desperation. Instead, he painted vivid pictures of Britain's heroic resistance, whilst subtly hinting at what would happen to American security if Britain fell and the Royal Navy passed into German hands. His December 8, 1940 letter was a masterpiece. 4,000 words detailing Britain's strategic position, acknowledging its financial exhaustion, and concluding that only American material support could sustain resistance. He didn't demand charity. He framed Lend-Lease as enlightened American self-interest. Roosevelt, genuinely moved and politically convinced, spent the next 3 months maneuvering the legislation through Congress. On March 11, 1941, Lend-Lease passed, effectively ending American neutrality by providing Britain with $31.4 billion in war materials. Hitler's diplomatic rigidity provided stark contrast. His ideology prevented the kind of flexibility Churchill demonstrated effortlessly. Nazi racial theory taught that Americans were mongrel degenerates controlled by Jewish finance, hardly a basis for alliance diplomacy. Hitler's contempt for Roosevelt, whom he considered a crippled puppet, leaked into diplomatic communications that offended American sensibilities. More strategically fatal, Hitler couldn't grasp how a democracy's leader could shape public opinion gradually through persuasion. He assumed Roosevelt's isolationist opponents would constrain him permanently, failing to recognize that Churchill's propaganda, his speeches broadcast across America, his cultivation of American journalists, his romantic presentation of Britain as democracy's last redoubt, was systematically shifting American public sentiment towards intervention. Churchill's August 1941 meeting with Roosevelt aboard ships off Newfoundland demonstrated the drunk's diplomatic skill. This was their first face-to-face encounter, and Churchill arrived determined to charm whilst extracting maximum commitment. He organized a joint Sunday church service on HMS Prince of Wales, carefully selecting hymns that emphasized shared Anglo-American values, including Onward Christian Soldiers and O God Our Help in Ages Past. Roosevelt, a skilled politician himself, later admitted he'd been emotionally manipulated but didn't mind because Churchill's theatrical sentimentality served both nations' interests. They produced the Atlantic Charter, a statement of war aims that positioned America as Britain's ideological partner, months before Pearl Harbor forced formal belligerency. Hitler's military decisions during this period reflected thinking untempered by alcohol but equally impaired by amphetamine-fueled grandiosity and ideological blindness. His December 11, 1941, declaration of war on America following Japan's Pearl Harbor attack was strategically insane. Germany had no treaty obligation to join Japan's war, and American fury was directed entirely at Tokyo. Hitler's decision handed Roosevelt the political gift of unified American entry into the European War, precisely what Churchill had been maneuvering towards for 18 months. When Churchill heard the news, he later wrote that he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. Britain's survival was now assured. The supposedly impaired drunk had orchestrated the world's greatest industrial power into alliance, whilst the teetotaler genius had casually made the strategic blunder that guaranteed his eventual destruction. Churchill's peak whiskey-soaked charm had achieved what military force alone couldn't. He'd made Britain's cause America's cause through patient psychological cultivation that Hitler's rigid ideology rendered impossible. Hitler's June 22, 1941, invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, handed Churchill an opportunity that tested whether sentiment or strategy governed his decisions. Churchill loathed communism with aristocratic fervor, having supported military intervention against the Bolsheviks in 1919 and spent 2 decades warning about Soviet expansionism. Nazi propagandists anticipated gleeful British neutrality as 2 totalitarian systems destroyed each other. Instead, within hours of the invasion, Churchill made the cold calculation that any enemy of Hitler was a friend of Britain, regardless of ideological revulsion. That evening, he broadcast to the nation, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The remark was quintessentially Churchill, using humor to acknowledge moral complexity whilst announcing ruthlessly pragmatic policy. His immediate offer of military assistance to Stalin demonstrated strategic thinking unclouded by either alcohol or ideology. Britain's material capacity to help was limited. Its own forces were overstretched across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and home defense. But Churchill understood that every German division bogged down in Russia was one not invading Britain or reinforcing Rommel in Libya. Within weeks, he committed to Arctic convoys delivering tanks, aircraft, and supplies to Murmansk, despite catastrophic shipping losses to U-boats. The first convoy, codenamed Dervish, sailed on August 21, 1941, carrying 48 Hurricane fighters. It was militarily expensive. Britain could ill afford to divert resources, but strategically brilliant. Stalin's survival meant Hitler faced the two-front war that had destroyed Imperial Germany in 1918. Hitler's decision to invade Russia revealed thinking that was sober, but fatally flawed by ideological obsession. His concept of Lebensraum, living space for the German race, demanded Eastern expansion regardless of strategic circumstance. Never mind that Britain remained undefeated, that U-boats hadn't starved the island into submission, that the Royal Navy controlled sea lanes. Hitler's racial ideology taught that Slavic subhumans led by Jewish Bolsheviks would collapse within weeks under Aryan assault. He told his generals to prepare for an 8-week campaign. When Field Marshal von Rundstedt cautiously suggested consolidating Western gains before opening an Eastern front, Hitler dismissed him as defeatist. This wasn't alcohol impairing judgment. It was ideological certainty producing strategic blindness, more dangerous than any drunkenness. The contrast in decision-making styles became stark as winter approached. Churchill, receiving intelligence that Moscow might fall, nevertheless maintained convoy schedules and pressed Roosevelt to extend Lend-Lease to the Soviets. His strategic logic was simple. Russian resistance, however achieved, served British interests. He felt no need to like Stalin or approve of Soviet tyranny. Grand strategy transcended personal sentiment. When critics in Parliament questioned arming communists, Churchill responded with brutal clarity, "I have only one purpose, the destruction of Hitler, and my life is much simplified thereby." This was cognitive flexibility that Hitler's ideological rigidity couldn't match. The Führer couldn't ally with Stalin even when strategically advantageous because Nazi racial theory made Slavic partnership ideologically impossible. By December 1941, Operation Barbarossa had stalled in Russian winter, costing Germany over 750,000 casualties, with Moscow still unconquered. Hitler's sober genius had opened a vast eastern front that would ultimately consume the Wehrmacht. He began overruling his generals with increasing frequency, insisting ideology trumped military logistics. His orders, forbidding tactical retreats, demanding soldiers hold positions to the last man regardless of encirclement, reflected the same inflexibility that prevented diplomatic maneuvering. Meanwhile, Churchill's supposedly impaired judgment had forged an alliance with the communist devil himself, splitting German military focus and setting conditions for eventual victory. The teetotaler's ideological purity produced strategic catastrophe, whilst the drunk's pragmatic amorality created winning coalitions. Goebbels' propaganda stopped emphasizing Churchill's drinking during this period, not because he'd stopped, but because the insult no longer explained how he kept outmaneuvering Hitler's clear-headed leadership. The narrative was becoming embarrassing rather than persuasive. By 1942, the drunk Churchill insult had largely vanished from Nazi propaganda. Not because Churchill had changed his habits, but because the narrative no longer served German morale. How could Goebbels explain to the German public that their armies were stalled in Russia, their cities being bombed by the RAF, and their U-boats increasingly hunted by Allied technology, all whilst supposedly fighting a leader impaired by alcoholism? The insult's disappearance from official propaganda coincided with its replacement in private Nazi communications with a more worried assessment. Churchill was proving disturbingly resilient, his stamina seemingly inexhaustible, his strategic judgment frustratingly sound. Meanwhile, Hitler's own physical and mental deterioration was becoming impossible to hide from his inner circle. Churchill's work routine during 1942 and 1943 would have broken men half his age. He was approaching 70, overweight, surviving on 5 hours of biphasic sleep, yet maintaining a schedule that left younger colleagues exhausted. His typical day began at 8 a.m. with papers and breakfast in bed, followed by meetings until 1 p.m. luncheon. After his 90-minute nap, he resumed work at 5 p.m. and continued through midnight or beyond, often dictating correspondence until 2 or 3 a.m. His transatlantic journeys, 5 trips to North America between 1941 and 1945, plus conferences in Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta, involved grueling travel by sea and air. His private secretaries noted that he maintained this pace whilst consuming his usual alcohol, yet remained mentally sharp during complex strategic negotiations with Roosevelt and Stalin. Hitler's decline provided grim contrast. Dr. Morell's medical records captured after the war reveal escalating pharmaceutical dependency. By late 1942, Hitler was receiving daily injections of Eucadal, a German brand of oxycodone, combined with methamphetamine, testosterone, and various quack preparations, including extract of bull semen for vitality. His Parkinson's-like tremor, visible in films from 1943 onwards, worsened steadily. His rage episodes became legendary. General Heinz Guderian described Hitler screaming for hours during strategy meetings, his face purple, foam forming at his mouth. These weren't characteristics of sober strategic thinking. They were symptoms of stimulant psychosis, combined with the psychological stress of losing a war his ideology insisted was unlosable. The military consequences of Hitler's deteriorating judgment compounded throughout 1943. His refusal to authorize retreat from Stalingrad despite the Sixth Army's obvious encirclement resulted in 290,000 casualties and Germany's first major defeat. Field Marshal von Manstein later wrote that Hitler's insistence on holding indefensible positions wasn't strategy. It was ideological stubbornness mixed with drug-induced detachment from reality. When generals presented casualty figures and logistics reports proving positions were untenable, Hitler dismissed them as defeatists lacking willpower. His April 16, 1945 order, issued from the Berlin bunker as Soviet artillery sounded outside, commanded non-existent army groups to relieve the capital. He was giving orders to phantom divisions, his grip on reality completely severed. Churchill, meanwhile, suffered his own health crisis, a heart attack, in December 1941 during his Washington visit, which his doctor concealed. He experienced another in December 1943 following the Tehran conference, this time with pneumonia. Yet he recovered both times and resumed his punishing schedule, his mental acuity undiminished. His May 1945 victory broadcast was delivered with the same verbal precision as his 1940 speeches. Filmed footage from the Potsdam Conference in July 1945 shows a 70-year-old Churchill negotiating complex post-war arrangements with Stalin and Truman, his cognition obviously intact despite 5 years of war leadership and unchanged drinking habits. The drunk had outlasted the teetotaler through sheer resilience, disciplined routine, and cognitive flexibility. Hitler's pharmaceutical cocktail had failed him far more catastrophically than Churchill's whiskey ever did. By war's end, it wasn't Churchill's drinking being questioned. It was whether Hitler had been in his right mind at all. The insult had completely reversed. Nazi true believers whispered that perhaps the Führer's judgment had been compromised by Morell's treatments. The drunk's supposed disability had proved far less disabling than the sober man's. Chemical enhancements. Hitler spent his final days in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery, a concrete tomb where reality no longer penetrated. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops fought street by street towards his location, he married Eva Braun, dictated a final testament blaming Jewish conspiracies for Germany's defeat, and shot himself. His body was burned in a shell crater. The man who dismissed Churchill as a drunk unfit for leadership ended his life in paranoid delusion, having led Germany to utter ruin. Churchill, the supposed alcoholic, was preparing for the Potsdam Conference, where he'd negotiate the post-war order alongside Stalin and America's new president, Harry Truman. The contrast in their endings reflected the contrast in their judgment throughout the war. Churchill's post-war career dismantled any lingering suggestion that alcohol had impaired him. He lost the July 1945 election, a shock that hurt him deeply, but returned as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955. His peacetime administration dealt with complex issues including Korean War diplomacy, nuclear strategy during early Cold War tensions, and managing Britain's transition from imperial power to modern European state. He was in his late 70s, still drinking his daily routine of weak whiskeys, champagne, and brandy, yet remained cognitively capable of governing. His 1953 stroke was kept secret from the public, but he recovered sufficiently to continue in office. Critics could argue many things about his post-war policies, but not that alcohol had destroyed his mental capacity. The 1953 Nobel Prize in Literature, awarded for his historical writings and oratory, provided official validation of the mind Nazi propaganda had dismissed as pickled in brandy. The Swedish Academy specifically praised his mastery of historical and biographical description as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. His 6-volume memoir, The Second World War, published between 1948 and 1953, demonstrated extraordinary recall of complex events, strategic reasoning, and literary craft. These weren't the products of an alcohol-damaged brain. His ability to reconstruct wartime decision-making in precise detail, often working from memory before consulting official records, impressed historians who expected the usual political memoirs' self-serving vagueness. Churchill's drinking had been constant throughout the war years when these memories were formed, yet his recall remained sharp. The historical irony became inescapable as post-war research revealed the truth about Hitler's pharmaceutical dependency. Albert Speer's memoirs, published in 1969, described Hitler's reliance on Morell's injections and his deteriorating health. Subsequent examination of Morell's records and testimony from Hitler's inner circle painted a picture of a man whose decision-making was chemically compromised from 1941 onwards, precisely the period when his strategic blunders multiplied. The ideologically pure teetotaler who'd mocked Churchill's drinking had been substantially more impaired by drugs than Churchill ever was by alcohol. Nazi propaganda's central insult had been projection. They'd attributed to their enemy the disability their own leader suffered more severely. Churchill died on January 24, 1965, aged 90, having outlived Hitler by 2 decades. His state funeral was the largest of the 20th century, attended by representatives from 112 nations. His body lay in state at Westminster Hall, where 321,360 people queued in winter cold to pay respects. Testimony that whatever his faults, the British people never believed Nazi claims about his fitness for leadership. He'd shaped the post-war world through his Iron Curtain speech, warning about Soviet expansionism, his advocacy for European unity, and his role as elder statesman during the Cold War's dangerous early years. None of this was conceivable for a man whose judgment had been destroyed by alcoholism. The drunk had outlived, outthought, and ultimately outlasted the man who tried to use that label as a weapon. Hitler's insult hadn't just failed. It had become a monument to his own inability to recognize that discipline and capability take many forms. The greatest irony was that Churchill's supposed weakness, his refusal to conform to others' expectations of sobriety and restraint, had been part of his strength. His authenticity, his refusal to pretend or moderate, his confidence in his own judgment despite criticism, these were the qualities of a leader secure enough to be himself, whilst the world burned. Hitler's teetotalism hadn't made him clear-headed. It had been one more expression of the rigid ideology that ultimately destroyed him.